At the last election, the island's housing crisis was a topic on every politician's lips. So what's happened to address this over the past 18 months? Government's island plan outlines a vision of everyone having a sustainable and affordable place to call home. But is that vision even close to being delivered? I'm joined in the studio by MHK David Ashford, Douglas Councillor Devon Watson and Port Erin Commissioner Hayley Fox, who will be helping me quiz the Housing Minister Chris Thomas. So can the Minister explain the rather complex structure which governs housing at the moment, and whether the structure actually is a little confused and in need of further reform? Housing sort of is a DOI responsibility. It's also the responsibility of the Housing and Communities Board. It's fair to say there was a debate on the DOI plan. One of the Tynwald members was rather disgruntled that you said, yes, but that would be a matter for the Housing and Communities Board, not the DOI, even though you are the chair of one and the minister of another. Is the current arrangement confused and in need of further reform?
Probably, and one of the actions in the Housing and Communities Board action plan is to address that very issue. So infrastructure historically has had a huge role for housing, but it's constrained by the legislation. We've got a bill in place called the Housing and Communities Bill, which can be used to address legislative defects, and the Housing and Communities action plan is excellent, has laid out the issues. We've got an excellent advisory board made up of 5 experts, in each in their own way, about housing and communities issues, and it's been great to start 6 or 7 initiatives with them through working groups.
And in relation to housing, well over half of public sector housing is provided by local government. Is there a place for local government on your Housing and Communities Board?
We have lots of ways of liaising with the housing providers. So in the late summer, early autumn, we went out around the regions to have discussions with officers and commissioners and councillors about housing matters. On the table there was the concept of fixed-term tenancies and review of those. On the table there was the concept of how we fix rents each year, because at the moment we have quite a political process and that's perhaps not ideal. On the table there was the whole future of mid-rent housing. And finally, I think we talked about the use of a software programme called Civica, which Douglas Borough Council use and the Department of Infrastructure use, and we would like to make available to all housing providers. We also have things like Clerks Forum and Housing Professionals Forum, so I think that's the way that we will continue to talk with housing providers rather than through the Housing and Communities Board, because ultimately the Housing and Communities Board is advisory. It's made up of somebody who has an expertise in dealing with homelessness, somebody who's an estate agent, somebody who's a bit of a property developer, and those sorts of skills. And I say it's had a role, it's laid down a programme, and we've got long established 40, 50, 60 years of activity with housing providers around public housing.
And presumably the role of this board is to try and pull together all the various elements of government that have some level of responsibility, and perhaps come up with some overarching policies.
Well, some politicians are more focused on policies and strategies, and other politicians are more focused on actions and doing stuff. And I think the last 15 months has been about actions and doing stuff. So DHSC took primary lead in putting together a better solution for dealing with homelessness, and made good progress with their Department for Enterprise at the Land Registry is responsible for taking money off people for land transactions, and they've carried on leading in that space. DOI has carried on with housing providers in terms of public sector housing and expanding our mid-rents. If we go to things like the Empty Properties Initiative, because we have a massive issue in the Isle of Man with vacant properties and derelict properties and brownfield sites, I suggest that the lead on that has been taken by people like the Manx Development Corporation and underneath the Brownfield Regeneration Steering Committee that David helped set up, and also by what's called the sort of planning reform programme in the built environment. I'd say they had the primary lead, which is sort of DFE types.
David Ashford, you have had various experiences in relation to housing. You've been the lead councillor on housing for Douglas Borough Council, and also for a brief period. You were Treasury Minister and had to pull together a budget with various commitments in relation to public sector housing. Do you think that the kind of piecemeal approach to housing that we have is conducive to addressing what was described, certainly by many at the last general election, as a housing crisis?
I think housing is going to be absolutely fundamental to the future of our Ireland, and this administration has to ensure that they get the housing policy right. And that's across the board, not just social housing, but also private sector housing in terms of rent to buy, in terms of first-time buyers, second-time buyers. All of it needs to be in the mix and all of it needs to be joined up. That was the purpose of the Housing and Communities Board being created at the start of this administration, was to pull all those strands together and give it one joined up place. We both know, Phil, we've both battled at times with one department doing one thing and another department doing another. And this is now where it's got to stop, because if we don't get housing right, then we won't deliver on our economic strategy. We won't deliver on the wider Ireland plan, because everything that we do is embedded under the housing policies, because we will not attract people to the island if we haven't got housing correct.
And do you think, the Minister obviously believes that he's been all about action and hasn't had time for strategy and policy. Are you convinced that the government generally has delivered the sort of action that many people on the doorstep would have been expecting?
I think progress has been made, to be fair to Chris and the Housing Communities Board, and Chris has laid out some of the actions that the Housing Community Board's taken. But the proof will be in the pudding once the draft Housing and Communities Bill actually comes forward and what it does. I think one of the problems is when we talk about housing, we still talk about different types of housing in isolation, in silo mentality. So we'll have a debate about social housing, we'll have a debate about private sector housing, about first-time buyers, not realising they're all actually intertwined, and that unless we actually treat them as one overarching policy, then we will not deliver on housing. We've got to stop this silo mentality of discussing and placing issues in boxes when it comes to housing. It's about the overall housing mix on the island, because not everyone is always going to own their own home. There's always going to be a need for social housing. There's always going to be need for a vibrant rental sector as well. And it's important that we get all of that into one debate and one policy rather than actually looking at it individually.
Hayley Fox, you're a new voice to this programme, and you've got a lot of experience, both as a housing officer and now since, you tell us how long, a Port Erin Commissioner.
Port Erin Commissioner, December 2022, so only been a couple of months, but worked in housing since 2006, 2007. So
you've had a lot of experience from the other side of this debate, from the officer side trying to deliver housing. Are you convinced that we've got things right in terms of the way in which housing is delivered on the island?
It'd be easy to be overly critical of certain administrations, past and present. I think the changing landscape of housing, especially after the pandemic and rising costs and things, has made a lot of things a lot worse. And as David said, you can't look at housing in isolation, private sector, private rented sector, social housing, because they all influence each other. Private rent's going up so high, we see this every day. People who can't afford their rent, they then don't qualify for social housing because the income limits are too low. They're all intrinsically linked. So I think, as has been pointed out, there is an all-island crisis with all housing.
And you're engaged with, you work for Castletown Commission as housing officer, and you're engaged with a development at the moment. How does that work? Because there's a government involvement in this, there's a Castletown Commissioner's involvement. How does that all work from an officer perspective?
Well, I obviously came into Castletown Commissioners when the project was already in its inception, but the way I understand it, obviously the DOI set out the parameters, specification, and our project managing it through the petition process that we've been through with them. So they largely control quite a lot of the design standards and different spec of the project. We've been able to have some influence on that, but it's largely the DOI that have led the project.
And it's Castletown Commissioners' money? Because again, I think most people listening don't really understand how all this works. Who actually pays for the housing?
Well, the taxpayer, obviously. We've had to petition for the fund that's it's borrowed over a 30-year period, I think. I might be wrong. I'm not sure on the figures with that. As I say, I wasn't involved in the project at the beginning. But the money is borrowed from government by us through a loan basis. So.
Yeah. And then you pay back the loan, but there's also a deficiency payment which covers a lot of that, which you get again from, ultimately from Treasury through the DOI.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Devon Watson, you've been suspiciously quiet in the corner there. You're now the lead councillor, I think, for housing in the Douglas City. Is it Douglas City Council yet?
Yeah, 100%.
Great. So what does that role involve? Because Douglas is Douglas the largest actual housing owner on the island, public sector housing?
We're the largest public sector housing owner on the Isle of Man. We have about 5,400 tenants, 2,500 properties, and what our role is to build and maintain existing social housing. So we've recently put out a 10-year plan, and obviously that's going to be made public fairly soon. But our job is to not only expand the amount of social housing we have, which is absolutely critical, but then also at the same time improve maintenance and communication with tenants that we currently have. Obviously, we're a large organisation relative to the Isle of Man, and sort of providing that housing is absolutely essential. One thing I do want to sort of touch on is the assumption, and I think there's a big public assumption when we talk about local authority and social housing as being sort of this massive cost on the taxpayer. One thing I would like to point out, though, is that it is probably the most efficient use of public funds in alleviating poverty of any government program that we have, right? If you look at my private sector rent, I pay about £1,450 a month for a 3-bedroom house that I'm going to be moving into, just signed the lease like a few days ago. There are no other options, right? But the equivalent property owned by a local housing authority or the council would cost about £450 to £500, right? So for an average deficiency of roughly about £50 per person averaged per month, that individual will end up saving between £800 and £1,000 a month. Just purely on VAT receipts, it comes back to the government. But in terms of providing people with stability long term, it's probably the most efficient use of public funds we have, and one of the few government programs we have that can take someone who lives in poverty and give them a pathway into the middle class. It's something we need to be building far more of, and we're fairly desperate to sort of see a lot more work with DOI and Treasury to see that happen. But as has happened at the moment, we're really happy that Chris Thomas is in the role that he's in, because he's recently done a lot of work that has made our job a lot easier. He's increased the amount of money that we're allowed to spend on maintenance, which can help deal with older issues. He's been really enthusiastic at helping work with us and sort of approving new housing plans, and we hope to do a lot more. But on the Isle of Man overall, despite the good work that's been happening in the past few years, there is no single person who controls housing, and which is why our housing is in a state of failure. I mean, there's no other way about it. Tenants have the worst rental rights of anywhere in Western Europe. We're one of the only national jurisdictions that doesn't have a homeless shelter. Housing prices grow unabated, and we lack certain things that even the Scottish government, with a lot less power, has managed to implement, such as rent control. The English government, run by the Tories, never known for being particularly pro-tenant, has introduced 2 housing reforms since we've last updated our housing legislation, in which tenants over there have powers such as they know that their deposit isn't just going to get swallowed up at the whim of a landlord, even if their property is okay at the end of the day. They've got security of tenancy. They've got the right to sort of keep pets within their homes, right? So tenants on the Isle of Man are in a lot more precarious position, which is why when you don't get any of the tax benefits over here when you're below like a certain income threshold, but you pay twice the rent that someone in Yorkshire does, why would you stay on the Isle of Man? And housing is critical to ensuring that the demographics of the Isle of Man stay roughly stable, and we continue to sort of have a pension system and an NHS.
And, I mean, you're certainly younger than a number of the people in the studio. Do you think young people are convinced that the government's doing enough, and when I say the government, I include local and central government on this, doing enough to address what was deemed to be a housing crisis just around 18 months ago.
You can see that in action, right? And people are not voting in the ballot box because they assume they've got a fundamental distrust of government. When I was elected, there was like 4 or 5 young voters out there, but really young people are checking out the Isle of Man. A lot of people are giving up, and you can see this in census and demographic data that the Isle of Man continues to lose young people at a fairly rapid rate. And what we're seeing is this isn't sort of the same population pyramid that we're seeing in sort of competing jurisdictions. It's a huge issue. I think people don't feel like there's enough being done, and people have sort of resigned themselves to the fact that the housing market is going to be permanently bad. When you look at stats that have come out of the UK recently, this is by the Financial Times, not exactly some left-wing paper, but like the average household in Slovenia is going to be richer than the average household in the UK by 2024. The average household in Poland is going to be richer than the average household in the UK by 2029. And I think people are seeing that. And if you're a young person, the best financial move you can make is leave the Isle of Man and leave the UK for better shores. And if we don't do something about this, our pension and NHS systems are not going to be sustainable.
Minister, this does kind of drive a coach and horses through government's whole, the core element of government strategy, which is to bring more people onto the island, more economically active people. If the economically active people who are here already feel that living here is no longer a viable prospect, how are you going to bring more people in?
No, housing is absolutely crucial in the economic strategy. That's why providing the right infrastructure for a population of 100,000 potentially by 2037 was upgraded as part of the consultation process. Absolutely vital. And everybody who's talked about intergenerational fairness is correct, and we did provide the evidence in our intergenerational fairness report a few years ago, which says that younger people have less life chances in terms of careers, pensions, housing, and it's just factually self-evident that, for the first time for decades, for generations, young people are going to do worse on average than their parents. So we get, unless we do something about it profoundly. So we have to get it right. And just wanted to pick up on some of the issues that Devon kindly mentioned, because there really are important issues. Also, as Hayley mentioned, funding. DOI pays 6.5, 7, 8 million for deficiency. The rest is paid by rents, and it is a really efficient measure. But Douglas is incredibly ambitious. It's got a huge investment plan, and so Treasury and DOI have to be concerned in as much as we've got to make sure that we get the value for every pound spent in terms of that deficiency payment. And we have a system called BRICS in the DOI, into which the data is working. We're putting on it. We're thinking about changing.
Just in relation to the deficiency payment, then, just explain to those who don't understand, and to be fair, it's not the easiest and straightforwardest of formulas. How does this actually work?
So since 1999 in the Tynwald resolution, basically we at DOI do work with local authorities and approve things just as Hayley described, and then through the year and at the end of the year we make a transfer over to local authorities to help them with their maintenance, with their investment and the like. So that's what the deficiency payment is. So, Castletown doing this huge project in School Hill, West Hill. You also have your own housing reserve. By chance, I was looking at your accounts and Douglas's accounts and all the other local authority accounts. Yesterday, you have 1.2 million. You don't actually have anything in your housing reserve. But all these things are looked at in the context of how the deficiency payment is paid to the local authorities. And that's one thing that we're worried about, because if we are going to be able to say to Douglas, do more, it's got to be finance from somewhere. So I hope that's enough. But I wouldn't mind coming back to address the issue of homelessness and occupancy deposit a bit later on in the programme if there's time.
I guess that's one of the issues, right? I mean, we've taken this really critical national issue and we've given perhaps the largest issue facing the Isle of Man, and we've given it down to local authorities. And yeah, we were ambitious, and I think it's because Douglas is building a lot of social housing that obviously there's a lot more financial pressure, because I think there's a lot of people, both on an officer and a council level who recognise a housing crisis, and if we don't do something about this, not only do we suffer. I mean, it would be far easier for us as a local authority to say we can't really be bothered building any more social housing. We just put all this money into maintaining properties and sort of making sure things are okay, because it's complex work. But I think that generally what we need is a government project, like we had after the war, really, that will focus on sort of providing decent, affordable housing for a lot of people. And I think a lot of that comes on government, and there's a lot of really good, hard-working government. But there also does need to be a lot of pressure put on the private sector to say, hey, guys, I know that recently the Manx Landlords Association did complain about even the existence of a register, right? I mean, these are the bare minimums in terms of what we need in order to sort of ensure basic regulation of the private sector, because it does need to do its part. When you end up having, so I pay more for a one-bedroom house, or I did pay more for a one-bedroom flat than I would for a four-bedroom public sector house. And obviously that puts a lot more pressure on local authorities. And every week we have an allocation meeting where we have to choose who gets social housing. So we sit in a room and you have to make a choice. Does it go to a homeless young person, or does it go to an older person with disabilities? And these are heart-wrenching, extremely difficult choices. And it puts this extreme amount of pressure to build more social housing to get it done. But if there was better regulation and protection, and perhaps even vacancy taxes that brought more properties into use, it would sort of make the housing situation a lot more stable and a lot easier to sort of finance.
David Ashford, I mean, you're, I was going to say you're in that sort of rare position of being in a government that's only existed for just under 18 months, having been part of the government and then also been outside of government. But actually there's a growing number of members who can join that club. But from your perspective, I mean, obviously after the election, housing was a really big issue. It was every candidate had raised this as a big concern. Government obviously sat round and came up with plans. Obviously, we know that you had to leave government just before the summer. Are you convinced that all the plans that had been laid down were sufficient at the time and are actually being implemented?
Well, I've always made quite clear that from my point of view, action plans and strategies are great. But Chris said there's different types of politicians, and I'm one of those politicians that likes to see action. Because one of the things I've seen over the years in my involvement in politics is you can have wonderful colour glossy documents which say absolutely wonderful things as to where you want to get to. But if you don't actually take the journey and do it, that's all they are. They're words on a page. And one of the things we've got to ensure for all of us, be it at local authority level or national level, representing our constituents, is that housing doesn't drop down the agenda. Because Chris is quite right when he says housing is absolutely fundamental to everything. And we also mustn't slip back into a trap of this one size fits all. So even if you look at social housing and local authorities, different local authorities have different needs when it comes to social housing. Devon's just pointed out there about single individuals, and unless something's radically changed in Douglas, which I don't think it has, the vast majority of Douglas's housing list, the people who've been waiting the longest, are people after 1 or 2 bed flats, who are single couples or don't necessarily have children. Whereas there's other local authorities I know who are crying out to try and house 3 bed families. So we've got to stop this whole trap of we'll design something and that's it, and trying to smack square pegs into round holes. And the Housing and Communities Board and Chris carry a great burden on their shoulder because they're the people who've got to deliver this. That board was created, as I say, to pull everything in from government, all the disparate strands you spoke about, where one department would do one thing and the other department over there would be doing something different. That board has to deliver, because if it doesn't deliver, we don't get the economic strategy, we don't grow the population, and that then has fundamental effects on our island going forward. So we've got to actually start moving it forward. I think the plan that's in place from the Housing Communities Board is great, but I'm always cynical in nature, Phil, and I'll start believing things when I actually see them in action on the ground.
Well, we'll take a short break and come back after these adverts. Hayley Fox, when the government plan sort of first became public, I think there was quite a reaction, particularly among people of younger people, young economically active people, who were saying, well, this is all well and good, but we can't afford to live here. Do you think enough has been done to convince that generation that actually government's on the case and things are going to change?
In a nutshell, I'd say no, to be honest. As someone that falls into that category, who is also, like Devon, privately renting at a premium, a 2-bedroom property is £1,200. If I want to stay south, you're talking even more than that. I don't qualify for social housing. I don't earn a bad wage, but it's not going to be enough to be able to buy a house again now. So no, speaking as somebody who's living that experience, I don't think there is.
And what would you like to see? I mean, putting aside your Port Erin Commissioner's hat and your Castletown Commissioner's housing officer hat,
Many hats.
Yeah, but what would you like to see in terms of the overall picture? Maybe there are specifics in Port Erin and Castletown you can refer to as well.
I appreciate the south is a very expensive place to live anyway, but all Ireland, the rents are out of control now. I speak to Housing Matters 3-4 times a week some weeks, saying that they just don't have anywhere for people. Then that's causing a lot of people to end up being of no fixed abode, which is far worse than it's ever been. There's not any real allocation of points for that. You can do an assessment to see if people are homeless, and there's some arbitrary points applied, but there's not really an assessment process to push them further up the list. There's nowhere to put them in the meantime because there's no legislation. We have no obligation as a local authority to house people. We have no emergency housing. I know that's digressing slightly from the young person situation you're asking me about, but there are a lot of single, especially males, that are homeless on the list with me at the minute. And then that feeds into mental health. You know, they're a huge category for, obviously, suicide. So all these issues are all affecting people's well-being.
Minister, I mean, you were hoping to return to this subject, so Hayley has very neatly brought you the opportunity. How does government, what has government been doing? Because I think you have been active in this area.
So I think there's about 3 or 4 different responses. One is to help people in terms of shared equity, first-time buyers. If home ownership is the target, you know, we have changed the thresholds. We've changed the way that the house prices are taken into account in the schemes. We have launched that, and we are doing a more fundamental review to index link and also to look at alternatives to the previous shared equity schemes. In terms of getting more people into public sector housing, public housing, we have to listen to Hayley, David, Devon, and actually work with Douglas and Castletown and do things ourselves to create more properties, which is what we are trying to do. So the DOI has got Ballacubban already approved coming forward. We're working on making sure the drainage at Crossags Farm is sorted out so that we can do something there. We'll revisit this on Tuesday in the House of Keys because David's got a question for me then, so I don't want to preempt all the information so I can embarrass him a little bit when he forgets something in his aggressive questioning. The other pilot that we've got, which I think might be helpful for somebody like Hayley as a young person who can't quite afford to buy if that's what she wants to do, might be hugely expanding the midterm pilot. The mid-rent pilot. I've called it mid-term twice now, so that must be psychological. But the mid-rent pilot, where we have 6 properties in Colby, where the idea being that you can actually save while you're paying a sub-market rent. We need a huge number extra of those, and we've talked with Douglas and all other local authorities about doing perhaps some of their new housing, not their existing housing, on the basis of being mid-rent properties to help people save up. And then I suppose the final point is to deal with people who are actually, what Hayley alleged were of no fixed abode. Well, of no fixed abode will need to be defined in the legislation. Are you genuinely of no fixed abode, meaning you've got nowhere else you can go to, or have you in some sense created your own no fixed abode? We've got to have a policy for the people who are completely no fixed abode, and then we've also got to have policies that work to help people who want to be in a different housing situation, and they're 2 slightly different ones. What we've done...
Turning your words around a little, Minister, policies or actions?
Well, actions. So therefore, what we've done, the Chief Minister said in terms of the last category, the Chief Minister said that by 1st of January we'd have in place a new system and government would have to do it if necessary. And it's been remarkably quiet. The media hasn't really asked us what happened around 1st of January. Well, basically what happened is we took a long look at it, particularly with a couple of members on our advisory board, and said, Gry, the facility at Gry really wasn't the solution. It isn't nice for anybody to pull down a roll-up mat and sleep on the floor. It really wasn't working. So supposedly, and it seems to be working because we've had a couple of close moments, close shaves. Now we've got a system of triage using social workers and people with experts housing, and then we make arrangements for people, specific people. When you're genuinely no fixed abode, you've got that doesn't help somebody who's on Hayley's housing list because they have got somewhere where they're sleeping at the moment. But since Christmas, we've had in place this triage system, and we will pay bed and breakfast. We will do things genuinely if you're in that category. And we're about to announce working with some strategic partners to actually move towards a better system, for dealing with that. In terms of, Hayley and the thousands of other young people who can't get the housing they want, that's much more fundamental, that's much more expensive. To build 100 social houses, think 25 million and hectares of land. 25 million's a lot of money, and Douglas doesn't own hectares of land for new properties. We've got some, but we need to work with Douglas and Castletown and other places to create more houses. Manx Development Corporation as well.
I think the one thing I want to jump in on that is that often what we look at is we look at that headline figure, and I agree. The Peel Road flats, for example, those cost 11 million to build, 12 million. But now, through general property price appreciation, those are worth 3 million more than what we built for, right? So now we own an asset that we've already sort of turned a sort of general profit on in terms of just the value of the asset. And that will pay back its loan eventually, but then those houses will probably be there for 60, 70, 80 years. Not only will I live there, but my grandkids could live there, or my great-grandkids could live there. It'll be an asset that is passed down generations, and it goes down to that old phrase of, I think I don't want to get philosophical here, but you plant a tree so that not necessarily that you yourself can sort of sit in its shade. And I think a lot of our anti-poverty work today has been done by people in the 30s who made the decision to clear the slums, the generation after the war who decided to build social housing to deal with that. And that was a big upfront cost for them, but we're still benefiting from that. And I think taking that long-term view that spending 10, 11, 20 million pound now means that people down the road save a lot of money, and we're investing in our grandchildren for future generations. But one thing I want to point out that we aren't talking about a lot is a sort of NIMBYism. And that's the biggest cause, I think, of driving our housing crisis, apart from global interest rates, is the fact that we talk about a housing crisis in an abstract fashion. But when it comes down to building more houses, which therefore increases housing supply, which decreases shortages, people are suddenly opposed, right? So we recently have an MDC development in central Douglas. And what that'll do is, for absolutely zero cost on the taxpayer, add 133 homes to the housing supply, and that will reduce pressure. Even if these were all mansions, high-quality luxury flats, that reduces pressure on high-end flats or mid-rent flats, and these effects do eventually end up trickling down. Japan is the only society in the world, in the developed world, that has falling housing prices because they've got a pro-building approach. But then what happens is when we move toward this approach of building more housing that will eventually be sold on the private market, a lot of politicians have a direct electoral incentive to oppose it, right? Because existing residents have concerns about parking, direct residents just don't want additional people living near them. So you end up having this perverse incentive in which, because you were elected by homeowners, you have no accountability to the potential residents who could live in your area. So our direct electoral incentives mean as though every individual MHK and commissioner and councillor has an incentive to prevent housing from being built near them. And that's an issue, especially when elections can be swayed by 30, 40, 50 votes.
David Ashford, when the whole matter of the 15, I'm still not at all convinced that targeting 100,000 people was the highlight and the main sort of policy theme of government's economic strategy. It seemed to me like shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. But the obvious question that I asked is, where are all the houses going to go? And it's fair to say that ministers looked at the floor and shuffled a bit and were rather embarrassed, and then said, oh yes, but it's all going to be brownfield development, so we don't need to worry about the not in my backyard argument. It is, though, I think Devon makes some pretty solid points about where MHKs end up. A certain proportion of the electorate tend to go out to vote. They tend, property owners are more likely to vote. Older people are more likely to vote. Older people are more likely to own properties. So doing things that potentially impact on their main asset is something that is going to have a big impact on people's choices when it comes to election time.
But also, that's changing hats for a minute. That's also, just following on from Devon, one of the reasons why it's important we have an independent planning system. I don't think we're ever going to remove NIMBYism. I think it's the old joke, isn't it, of we need 10,000 houses and we need them now, but not round the corner from me, sort of thing. And you're never going to remove that attitude. It's one of the reasons I've campaigned for many years that instead of this, to me, it's nonsense of having area plans. We need one all-Ireland plan when it comes to planning, because you just mentioned again about piecemeal things, Phil, and that's one of the most piecemeal things going, because by the time you've worked your way around the 4 area plans and you've done the final one, the first one's well out of date. And also when the inspectors look at area plans, they're looking at that little microcosm. We need something that actually says this is our Ireland plan, and be upfront to the public and say, if we're wanting to go down this route, this is where we need to be, this is where the build needs to be. You're never going to remove objections, but one of the reasons I chair the Independent Planning Committee is they will take into account objections, they will look at it, but they're not driven by what politicians say. The politician might oppose it, but they don't make the ultimate decision, the Planning Committee does. And that's very important, that there is that independence in the system. In terms of social housing as well and the need, I mean, Devon had some very good points, and he mentioned there about when social housing was developed, referring to Lord Street flats, which was an area I used to represent when I was on the council. They were built to clear out the old Barrack Street slums. It was a slum area around there prior to their building, and to actually give people proper, affordable, at the time, what was modern accommodation. State of the art, in fact, if you go back to about the 1920s. And that's what we need to get back to not seeing social housing as some sort of offshoot, but as something that is affordable, of proper quality, that people can be proud to live in. And actually, some of the social housing estates I have, Williston, Douglas North, they have the best community spirit. They have people who've been there many, many years. We've got some people in Williston who still go back to having been there from the 1950s with their pets since their parents. And that's what we want. We want to build great communities. It's there in the Ireland Plan, and that's one of the main targets, Housing Communities Action Plan. One thing I just want to pick up on, though, is Chris has laid out an awful lot of great things to drive forward, but a lot of that's going to need underpinning with legislation. Now, if you look at the Ireland Plan and the most recent update that came from government, which was discussed in January's Tynwald, on page 21 of that Ireland Plan, it says a modern housing and tenancy law with the Draft Housing and Communities Bill coming forward, what's now last month in January. But then you fast forward about 20 pages to page 40 of the Ireland Plan, and where is it in the legislative programme? It's phase 5. Now, looking at the legislative list, at the speed legislation's coming forward with at the moment, which deeply worries me, the slowdown legislation, we'll be lucky if phase 5 is the start of the next administration.
And phase 5, effectively, presumably, anyway, the phases would be... Phase 1 is this first year, phase 2...
If only it was that simple. Looking at it doesn't seem to quite work like that. And I worry that this is something that now isn't going to be pushed to the end of this administration, when we need to be pushing it at the start and actually moving on the actions, because it needs to be in lockstep with the economic strategy. So unless we're going to say we're going to pause the economic strategy for 4 or 5 years, then I don't quite see how at the moment what government's declaring as its legislative programme actually ties in with what it says it's going to do as actions.
Hayley Fox, I mean, you had an interesting experience because you were able to, you stood for the commissioners in Port Erin. Presumably you would have done some canvassing, and one of the things that certainly I found when I was canvassing in Rushen and then in my failed attempt at Arbury, Castletown and Maloo was it's a great opportunity to actually understand an awful lot more about the places that you live, because you get to visit most, if not all, of the houses in your constituency, and you see the range and difference in types of housing that's there. And certainly in Port Erin, we had some houses that had been built probably in the 30s, 40s, 50s, which were substantial and of a good standard, possibly decaying a bit by the time I was going around canvassing. And then you have relatively new houses which are quite tiny in comparison. Is that something that you've noticed, or is that something perhaps that we're getting wrong in relation to public sector housing, or indeed any sort of affordable housing?
I think in terms of attitudes, sort of post-war, when properties were built then, there was less people, there was less cars, that you didn't need to fit a lot more people into the areas that we have now. So yeah, obviously houses are a lot smaller being built now. Dandara, to take one developer, the properties that they build are the size and specification of them compared to somewhere like Edgermony, which was built years and years ago. They're obviously going to be quite a lot smaller. I don't necessarily, having not lived in a new build house myself, I couldn't specifically say, is it fit for modern living? I think, well, it depends on the size, or the type of lifestyle you live. I do think a lot of the new social housing is very nice. I've had the opportunity to look around the School Hill, West Hill, some of the apartments that have been built. We've had quite a lot of mixed feedback from the tenants with that. But looking at the energy efficiency, the cost that's going to be borne by them in terms of utilities and rent, they're so forward thinking. I think they're brilliant. I'd have one myself.
Good. That's encouraging.
One thing I do want to hammer on is I think also cultural expectations around housing sort of do need to alter a little bit. When you look at census figures, I mean, when you ask what's the average household size on the Isle of Man, people would say, maybe 3, 4. In reality, it's 2.2. In Douglas, it's lower. Most towns, it's lower. But on average, all over the Isle of Man, it's 2.2 people per household. And which means but the sort of houses that typically tend to be built are sort of 3-bedroom homes. And I think that what we do need to be moving toward, and when you look at where housing shortages are, they are in apartments. And I think that when you build houses in towns and in city centres and in town centres, you end up having these really positive spin-off effects, such as the first one being that it's a lot more affordable to provide services. They support a lot more businesses near them. So 3 apartment blocks, for example, that can sustain a shop, that can sustain like a hair salon. So if we want to sort of improve hospitality, brownfield development in towns has these sort of positive knock-on benefits that would otherwise not exist, and lower urban density creates situations in which we have growing problems of loneliness and isolation, not only in the Isle of Man, but in the Western world more generally. And often that is associated with the fact that people don't really live in communities anymore. If you live in a suburban house and you're a teenager and you don't drive, what else do you do other than, I don't know, if you live in Hong Kong, like go commit crime or something, right? Like if you're a kid, like there's literally nothing to do. And it's one of those things where when we put people in communities, it's a lot easier to provide services that sort of cater to them. Forgive me for being a bit facetious earlier, but in general, if we want to do like building housing and building sort of solid communities with services within 15 minutes where they are is also how we prevent things such as antisocial behavior. It's how we prevent loneliness and isolation. And there's a lot of people as they get old. We talk about younger renters a lot. But as people get older and they no longer drive anymore, and you're stuck somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, it becomes a lot more difficult to sort of engage with the community. So having people live in amongst and around each other can be really helpful for that.
Minister, I think David very ably demonstrated that actually there is a need occasionally for policies, strategies and new pieces of legislation. It's all well and good saying, judge me on actions, but actually the law enables you to act, doesn't it? And if the law is constructed in such a way that it's outdated, then the actions are much more difficult to achieve.
It's a really fair point about the legislation committee of council ministers moving the Housing and Communities Bill back, just because they, in their view, the drafting instructions weren't actually presented to the Attorney General's chambers, so that was their criteria as far as I know. But the law that matters are secondary legislation, so already we've had changes to the way that budgeting loans work in social security. Already we've changed the shared equity scheme. We're about to come forward with new social housing income thresholds in either April or May, Tim Ward. we've about to launch a procurement for the tenancy deposit, occupancy deposit scheme, and because we've made some policy decisions about how that should work. In other words, we want third-party holding of deposits rather than some sort of insurance scheme. So these are all really practical legal change, and that's where our focus has been, rather than on, putting in place the 1999 resolution, Tynwald resolution on deficiencies into law, which we need to do, but we need to do that a bit later, rather than focusing on making sure that mid-rent is actually completely legal. So I'd say we have.
Because again, Minister, I mean, part of your problem, and this is me trying to be a little bit generous to you now, is there's about 3 or 4 times the amount of work than you can ever possibly achieve.
That's true. That's true. So we've only got, in the housing thing, we've only got a couple of people working on it in terms of full-time policy people in the overall housing and communities framework. We've got a few more in housing division. But let's leave that aside.
And is that not a problem?
Well, it is a problem.
If housing is deemed to be a major crisis,
it is a problem. So the next person the public will see is we will be looking to recruit an empty properties officer to work with Douglas Borough Council and other places to actually understand why properties are empty. We already have housing matters that came up in this discussion. That's part of the issue, but the other issue is trying to understand, why we have probably 3,000 properties that are either occupied as holiday homes, second homes, or just left empty for other reasons, to see how many of those we can bring back in. But, I'm amazed some who I would have termed conservative politicians in the Isle of Man are talking about things like deemed income taxes on these second properties. It could be that we double or triple rates and let Douglas Borough Council keep the money from properties that have been vacant for 4 or 6 months. But that's hugely significant politically in the Isle of Man. We've never been in that place before. So I was shocked to hear some of the people who think that's a good idea these days, or I would have thought are natural conservatives, and I'm looking forward to seeing whether that sort of thing is politically acceptable in the island. I just want to go back to something that Devon said about the Manx Development Corporation, Westmoreland Village, and I'm not at all taking a view on this. I'm just stating some facts. As far as I can tell, although the planning application hasn't been submitted as yet, most of the properties in the Westmoreland Village, the ones that are not for me to nominate to somebody like Douglas as affordable houses, will be the similar sort of size to the traditional Dandara estate ones. In other words, they'll be below the affordable housing design guidelines, and that's really interesting to me. So what we're saying is a public state-owned developer using public state-owned equity is actually beginning, is proposing building smaller apartments, which sounds like you're very enthusiastic about, but that's got a huge policy dimension. Should we be encouraging people to live in smaller properties than we would say are normally acceptable under our public sector affordable housing guidelines? That's something that David will have to deal with when his planning committee, so he can't comment.
I think on that one specifically, I'm sorry, David, I just to jump on that, I think that, if you're a single guy and you've come over and we're bringing over key workers to deal with critical issues, I don't need a 2-bedroom, a large home. So I think having a variety of properties is very helpful at the end of the day. But yeah, I applaud the work that your committee is doing on this.
So sadly, we are now almost at the end of the programme, so maybe 20 to 30 seconds each on what are you hoping to see in relation to housing over the next few years. Start with you, David.
Well, legislative movement with action. I don't quite agree with Chris on the secondary legislation fund. Secondary legislation derives from primary. If you haven't got that right, you haven't got the powers. But we need to actually see action on the ground for young people, for families, where people actually feel their housing situation is improving. That'll be the measure, not what we chat about in Tynwald, but what people out there think.
Devon?
I'd like to see better protection for renters. I'd like to see a lot more social housing, vacancy taxes, and a sort of a rethink of how planning and building policies work.
And Hayley, you maybe have a little bit longer because David and Devon have been brief.
A regulated private rented sector, homelessness obligation legislation supporting that, more affordable housing for younger people, other options of tenure, mid-rent, like you said, an income threshold increase for social housing to capture the people because there's a cliff edge at the moment, and more suitable housing for the future, eco-housing.
Excellent. And Minister, you get the final word.
A great list from everybody else. One issue that hasn't come up so much in our discussion would be fixed-term tenancies, because we now have 54% of people on the island in public sector housing who do have fixed-term tenancies. 46% don't have them, so we've got to address that issue politically, because that's a bit unsustainable. And the other point is, David made a really good point about the area plan. We've also done things with departments in the Housing Communities Board around assessing the viability of brownfield sites, which has led to some initiatives. And secondly, we're just about to launch an objective assessment of housing need, which goes right to the heart of all the questions that Devon's been putting on the floor, which need to be answered. What do we actually objectively need? Hayley's mentioned it as well. What sort of people are out there, and how should we be meeting their demands?
That was Chris Thomas, David Ashford, Devon Watson and Hayley Fox. Do you think the government's response is too slow and woefully inadequate, or do you accept that it takes time to rebalance our housing infrastructure and are willing to give the Minister the benefit of the doubt? I'm Phil Gorn, Gurmayus and Geisha Thanks for listening.